Do y'all use enough midazolam when you're treating seizures? Do your protocols adhere to the national guidelines about how much and how you should give midazolam for seizures? Did you even know there were national guidelines on how to treat seizures? Well, no matter what your answer to those questions, join me and a couple of very special guests at a secret, undisclosed location as we do a deep dive into a paper that looks at exactly these things. So I have to warn you, this is a pretty nerdy podcast. I brought a methodologist on to talk about methodology. There were a lot of potential confounding variables in the way that this paper was written, but there were some pretty sharp authors on this paper, and they went to some really great lengths to control for those confounders, and they did it in some ways that I was not familiar with. So I wanted to learn at the same time y'all do. I brought on an expert, and boy, do I have the perfect expert. I really think y'all are going to enjoy this. But before we cut to the intro, I need to make a confession. So this, as y'all know, is a YouTube video with a podcast. I record the audio and the video at the same time. So to do this, I had a 2-camera setup to get great video of all 3 speakers. Turns out I only hit record on one of those cameras. That's because I'm a dork. I'm an idiot. I'm a moron. So what do we have? We have great audio of all 3 of us. We only have video of 2 of us. So I had to compensate somehow. So what I did is went and got as many pictures of our guest as I could find, and I substituted the pictures. So to my special guest, whom I completely eliminated from the video, my apologies. I promise I'll make it up to you somehow. And if y'all are listening to the audio only version of this, well, never mind. Y'all are in great shape.
What is a lighthouse? It is a tower with a bright light at the top, located at an important or dangerous place. The main purpose of a lighthouse is to serve as a navigational aid and to warn of dangerous areas. Welcome to the EMS Lighthouse Project podcast, illuminating the darkness of current EMS clinical practice with the bright light of science. Here's your host, Dr. Jeff Jarvis.
Howdy, y'all. I'm Dr. Jeff Jarvis. I am joined by Mikey Verkest.
What's up?
And Dr. Remle Crowe. Hi, Remle.
Hello.
And you might notice that we are not in my studio today.
We are not.
We're at ESO. ESO headquarters. It's ESO, you have data after dark. Well, this is sort of ESO after dark. And it is September, and it's hot as hell in Texas.
What are you talking about? It's under triple digits.
Well, this is true, not by much.
Yeah.
It's pretty warm. And one of the things that I learned is that after 5 o'clock at ESO headquarters, they turn the air conditioning off.
We save energy.
Yeah, you're nice and green, but I'm going to be sweating my butt off here because it's a little warm.
It's a little bit warm.
But we are here at ESO, and the reason we are here is I wanted to talk to Dr. Crowe and my friend Mikey about a paper. And Remle, you're actually an author on this paper, and it's using ESO data. So I thought this would be a great opportunity to do what I wanted to do for a while anyway, which is welcome my friend Mikey to Texas.
Thank you.
Well,
So, Mikey, tell us what you're doing with an ESO shirt on in an ESO building.
Well, since the last time I was on the EMS Lighthouse Project podcast, which was at FAST, remember the lights going up and down, and it was like
it drove me crazy editing.
Yeah, so this was not even a thing at that point. But yeah, since then, I've moved the family to Texas, and I'm a part of the training team, of the customer engagement team here at ESO, and we do training, and we're going to be doing podcasts and videos, all the stuff I love to do. I get to do that all the time. Like, it's
How
so cool.
awesome is that?
And still be sort of involved with fire and EMS and all that. It's going to be so good. But yeah, we've been here for about 2 weeks now. yeah, it's been a whirlwind.
Well, the one thing I can tell is you're coming from a fire department,
Yep,
typical fire department, to a private industry,
indeed.
and you are letting the beard fly.
Yeah, I'm trying.
I like it.
I don't know. We'll see.
You get out of, don't have to worry about a mask seal anymore.
I used to rock the goat
Yeah,
all the time.
I want to wear a beard, but I have to meet certain
a mask,
requirements.
right?
Yep.
But I just figured I mean, people probably watching can't even tell because it's just like 2 days old. But
This is
we're gonna try it out.
that's about a 3-month beard for Jeff.
It's not 2 days. It's probably a week.
Well, Remle, if you don't mind, give me, and specifically our listeners here, give us a good review of what you do here at ESO.
What I do, I am one of the nerds at ESO. I am the Director of Clinical and Operational Research.
So you are the chief nerd.
I might be. There's a Chief Medical
I like
Officer
it.
nerd, too.
I like it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so speaking of chief medical officer,
There's some other news going on.
what I have, I've always let y'all know what I do in the past. I'm the medical director for Williamson County EMS and Marble Falls area EMS here in Central Texas. But as of November 14th, hopefully by the time this podcast comes out, I'll be the chief medical officer and system medical director for MedStar Mobile Health in Fort Worth. I'm moving my family up to Fort Worth.
Congratulations.
Took a whole week for me being here for you to leave.
It's true.
That's super awesome.
Correlation
Mikey,
is
Mike-
not causation.
In most cases.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, congratulations.
Well, thank you very much.
What a big move, and golly, man, that's exciting. That's a big system.
I'm very excited. It's a very
So
big
much data.
system.
Yeah.
150 something thousand calls a year, lots of data. Very excited about the research work I can do there. I get to work with EMS fellows, and maybe impact the next generation of EMS physicians.
Are you still going to get to go
I'm
on
excited
calls?
about it. I can. I get an MD1 vehicle.
Oh,
All right.
man.
Well, I'll tell you what. Why don't we just jump right into it? Let's talk about this paper, shall we?
Yes.
Let's talk seizures. So, y'all all remember, because you were just reading this paper to me, because I know y'all just reviewed it.
Just did, yeah.
The Rampart trial,
Gosh.
which I'm pretty sure has the best name ever. Rampart stands for something, but basically it
About
is
seizures?
I don't know what it stands for, but it is a randomized control trial of 2 different benzos via 2 different routes
Yeah.
to find out what the best treatment for status epilepticus is. And what they did was they looked at 10 milligrams of IM midazolam, comparing it to 4 milligrams of IV lorazepam or Ativan. And what they found was that the 10 milligrams of IM midazolam had less need for rescue therapy. In other words, the seizures stopped better, and no increase in respiratory depression. So the message coming out of that trial was go big or go home, and that
Indeed.
was the exact words that they used. So we've known that for a while now. That information has been incorporated into guidelines that say for patients with status epilepticus, first-line treatment should be 10 milligrams of intramuscular midazolam. Go big, go home. Now, they also mention in those guidelines that intranasal midazolam is an option. This is a level B certainty of evidence as opposed to a level of A for the 10 milligrams of IM midazolam. But there is a question. Rampart was a little confounded because they mixed both route, dose, and drug. But there is a suspicion, i.e. by everybody who really knows much about this, that in EMS we dramatically underdose benzos. For some reason, we think 2.5 milligrams
Yeah,
is a
ring the bell on
reasonable
that.
dose
Yeah.
for, say, RSI, which it's not. Stop intubating people awake. So this question, the question they wanted to know, is what is the overall dosing pattern and route of administration of benzos for seizures? And then they wanted to look at the association between route and dose of specifically midazolam. And then their primary outcome was the cessation of seizures as indicated by you don't need to give a second dose.
Yeah. And if you're not from Texas, you might be hearing a strange word there, but I would call it the route of administration versus the route. Anyway, carry on.
But you didn't translate y'all all,
It should have been all y'all,
right?
but I wasn't going to go there.
Mikey,
It's too soon.
It's too soon.
here's your first test as a Texan.
Okay.
What does y'all, what is it? It's a contraction for what?
You all.
Yes. So you don't say all y'all.
But you said y'all all.
Yeah,
So,
you all.
so.
It's too early for that.
It's 2 sips of beer got him almost.
Exactly. By the way, thank you to ESO for the beer and the wonderful. This is a really cool theater here. You can see it's got lots of movie posters. What you don't see right out of frame is Dazed and Confused, where Matthew McConaughey got his start.
Indeed.
But you can see the cool little movie
Office
back
Space,
there.
Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Yeah.
Kill
and-
Bill.
What
I
was
like
that
it.
one?
Kill Bill.
Oh, Kill Bill.
Bill,
Yeah.
Part 1, I think.
All good stuff.
But anyway, thanks for the beer. So the question really is to what extent are we underdosing benzos via any route? And then what's the association between dose and route and no more seizures as the primary outcome? And the secondary outcome is, okay, well, if you give all of the benzos, you're probably going to stop the seizure, but you might stop the breathing too.
Yeah.
So the secondary outcome was the rate of need for ventilatory support as a surrogate measure for respiratory depression. And they measured that as endotracheal intubation, supraglottic airway administration, non-invasive positive pressure ventilation, and mask ventilation. Now, the way the population, and I think this is probably important to understand, they only looked at adults 18 or greater who were having a seizure. And the way they found those patients who are having a seizure is primary or secondary impression of status epilepticus, not just seizures, but status epilepticus. Now,
and
With administration of midazolam specifically.
of midazolam as the first benzo. So you could get phenytoin or Keppra or even ketamine, but as long as the first dose was midazolam, you were in good shape.
I thought I don't want this part to get lost either, and maybe it's not so much germane to the paper itself, but I found it interesting that there's just so many options for people to choose. Like you went with that sort of primary, secondary with the benzo because people can choose 50,000 different ways to document this, and it became sort of impossible.
Luckily, you
right?
could choose less when your software is configurable, which is one of the strengths of this particular data set is that, you're limited to 300 and something impressions, whereas I took a look in the NEMSIS 2019 data. Do you want to guess how many unique primary impressions there were?
Yes.
I'm going to go with 10,000.
I was going to say 4,573.
It's in between those two.
8,000.
About 7,000.
That was
my
oddly
gosh.
specific.
Well, it was
a good number,
Yeah,
yes. But that makes it really challenging when you're trying to do research like this, where you're interested in a very specific condition and getting down to it. So, we should give credit to Dr. Elon Guterman, who really was the lead on this, and she did all of the analyses. But she thought of, well, how can we try to find patients who are actively seizing in the presence of EMS? And there's no button in the software that says, was the patient
Actively
seizing while you were there?
A real problem.
So she did the best she could with these proxy measures, which was an impression indicating status and an administration of midazolam.
Yeah.
So if you look at that, say we want to capture everyone who needs a benzo for seizures,
Right.
doing it this way is going to miss an awful lot of people.
Right.
So it's not very sensitive. On the other hand, it is pretty damn specific.
Well, and we should think about what was the goal of this study. So they weren't trying to quantify what % of patients get a treatment. They wanted to look at the agreement or the association between getting the right
did
treatment
get it.
and an outcome.
Yeah.
And so for an association, that's a great way of getting a narrow population of exactly what you want versus casting a broad net and bringing in a lot of noise.
So I really like that. The other thing they did to try to really narrow it down, so she wrote up another paper, sort of a preceding paper, that looked like it was a single agency. I'm assuming it was from Oakland?
Alameda.
Yeah. Whereas this is from a much larger data set with the ESO data set. And she found that it turns out we're underdosing seizures.
Yeah.
But how can that be when the Rampart showed it was 10 milligrams?
Knowledge translation. Rampart, actually, we're coming up on, well, it's not quite 10 years.
It's been a while.
It has been a while. But then we've known that it was cruel and inhuman to use 2.5 milligrams in RSI before pushing a paralytic, roughly speaking, forever, and yet we still do that. Yeah. So it does take a while to get the information out.
Indeed.
You know what the darkness of EMS clinical practice needs, Mikey?
Some light, baby.
It does. It needs
light.
the bright light of science. So that's the whole point, and this is her point here. So again, inclusion criteria, greater than 18, primary or secondary impression of status epilepticus, received a benzo via IV, IM, or IN as your primary benzo. And then there were some exclusions, so they excluded kids, and they also excluded cardiac arrest. Right. And the reason they did that is you might need to give this drug for another reason. Awareness during cardiac arrest. Yep. I would say that benzos are the wrong drug for that, but you could.
Amen to that.
So that was excluded if you had an impression of cardiac arrest. They also excluded you if you had the pushies, so some CPR done, because that's a marker, so they excluded it. So that was the group. And again, just to think about this, they're looking for the association between how much benzo you give and how you give it. And then the outcome they were looking for was cessation of seizures as marked by need for rescue therapy and need for ventilatory support. So that is the question and why it's important. Let's get to the methods. So since we just happen to have a methodologist here and a methodologist who was on the paper and who knows this data set really well, I'm going to turn this over to you, Remle. What is going on? What were the methods? How did we try to answer this question?
Sure. So I think you did a great job setting us up. We talked about what was the primary exposure or the independent variable of interest, and that's the treatment itself, so the dose and the route. And then we talked about what the outcomes were, so looking at need for rescue therapy and need for ventilatory support. Now, they did some fun things in the analyses, and I'm going to try, not to go too into the weeds, but I don't think that Jeff's going to let me not go into the weeds.
No. Jeff has three very distinct questions, and I'll just actually it may be four. Let me. So I've told a lot of people.
I made it this far.
I know exactly. It's the beauty of this being my podcast.
Yeah.
I told Remle a while back. It was on a Sunday. She was trying desperately to relax, so of course I bombarded her with text messages. And I said, what is an instrumental variable approach? And she's like, oh, God, he's reading a paper. And then I said, what is a hierarchical multivariable logistic regression with agency-level random intercept? And then I wanted to know, what is a two-stage least squares regression? And finally, I want to know what falsification tests are. Because when I tell people how to read papers, the number one complaint, the number one reason people don't read papers is they don't understand all the fancy stats.
Yeah.
And what I tell them is that's all right, just skip over that. Assume, you may be assuming wrong, but assume
they did it right.
That they did it correctly. Yeah. And then it will become much more accessible. And as you do, you'll learn a lot more stats. So this is how I've learned that, and picking my friends carefully. So when I see things that I don't understand, I talk to people who know these things. So, Remle, talk to us about the methods, and then tell me what those things are.
So we say methods, we're talking specifically statistical analyses.
Did we already covered what the general methods? Okay, yes.
We can
so
move
let's
into
get
that.
into the analysis.
And I think Dr. Guterman did a lot of creative things here, which help us overcome some of the traditional downfalls of having a large observational data set. Obviously, we'd love to have an RCT, but having some data at our fingertips right away, this is a great way to dive in and see, is there something worth investing the time and money into another RCT, or what can we learn from here? And so one of the big downfalls of observational data is that it wasn't collected for research and things did not happen randomly, right? So you can imagine, what are some of the things that probably affect the route and the dose that you use to treat a patient with seizures?
Well,
just everything.
Like maybe I can give intranasal or intermuscular benzos, but I can't start an IV.
But why can you? What dictates that?
So maybe it's protocols by the agency.
Could be.
Maybe it's that Mikey just has shitty veins.
Exactly.
I can't get it in there.
So
maybe
some patient characteristics, or maybe he doesn't look to be having a severe
skin
seizure.
color, could be like a million different things.
size, right?
Size.
If I see a smaller person, maybe I'll just do 5. I don't know.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
These big bad
so
drugs
all
scare
of
me.
these things are not random. One of the ways that we call those things confounders, right? These things that confuse the effects between what we're really interested in, which is the dose and the route of the drug, and then, all the other things that are out in the world. So one of the things that Dr. Guterman did here is an instrumental variable approach, and that is a way of getting rid of some of these confounding variables. It's confusing and sounds really, wild, but it's kind of, you have several approaches to control for confounding. We talk about logistic regression a lot, and you can adjust for confounders that way. Instrumental variable is similar, but it's really creative. So it takes a variable that's related to your exposure, but not related to your outcome directly. So I'll give an example because that's confusing, right?
Do me a favor and just the term exposure can be confusing.
That's true.
So-
Exposure is your independent variable, or in this case, the treatment. So that's the route and the dose of midazolam.
There we go. Thank you.
So we need something that's related to the route and the dose of midazolam, but that's not related to our outcome, which is giving more meds or in rescue therapy or ventilatory support, right?
Okay.
Okay. But let's give an example with lay terms that might
Please.
be even, right?
Lay guy over here.
I'm going to start with the price of beer
Okay.
could be an instrumental
This
variable
is important.
for liver cancer. The price of beer might be related to an exposure of how much I choose to drink. If it's cheaper, maybe I drink more, right? Which is in turn related to my probability of getting liver cancer, probably. But the price of beer is not directly related to liver cancer other than through its association with how much I drink. So that's an instrumental variable.
Interesting.
It's actually really hard to find these in the real world. So the fact that we found one here that kind of works is really interesting and novel. And this is used in economics a lot. It's not used as commonly in a study like this, in a medical study, just because they're hard to find. So the instrumental variables here were things like agency averages. So taking that agency effect and saying, well, the agency is probably not directly responsible for the patient outcome, except for through how they're treating the patient and their protocols that are telling them what to do.
So tell me a little bit more about how they specifically did that from an agency level. It looks like they were taking either the median dose for that agency or the
proportion who got a certain route. Yep. So any of those are just looking for a way of quantifying an agency effect. And all this does, there's some things that are due to random chance alone. There's always random chance. And so some of the relationship that we're going to see between midazolam dose and route and the outcomes is just random. By taking that instrumental variable, we're taking out what's random, because what's random with one is going to be random with the other. So we adjust out that.
Hence the word.
And then we have the direct relationship between what we're really interested in and our outcomes.
Interesting. All right. That makes sense to you,
Does that
Mike?
satisfy your...
Yeah. I'm not sure I could do one of these, but I think I understand.
You could look up the R code.
Or I could, phone a friend.
It could happen.
So what is this this hierarchical multivariable logistic regression with agency level random intercept? Seems like that's a lot of words.
Yep. So in regular multivariable logistic regression, we treat everything as if it's independent, and that, that one encounter is totally independent of another encounter. But if you're at the same agency, do you think that your treatment patterns are going to be more similar than maybe, an encounter between your agency and another agency?
Yeah, my agency's great.
Well, obviously.
Ike's.
Mikey's.
Yeah, you don't have an agency anymore.
Well, that's the reason I felt good picking
That's
on
why he
my
could say
agency.
it. No, but so of course, like within a group or an agency, things are
think
going to be
so.
more similar than they would between agencies. And so what this multi-level modeling does is it creates clusters, and it adjusts for those clusters, which ultimately just makes your confidence intervals a little bit wider. So really your effect size stays similar, but you penalize for, there was some clustering going on. And it's important that we think about clustering, especially in EMS data where you have 2,000 agencies blended together.
Now, as Mikey and I were desperately trying to set our recording studio here up, you mentioned that, well, Jeff, you know what this is, and you said that it's similar to a GE, a generalized estimating equation.
Duh.
Why would you use... I'm sorry, I'm going to go off on a tangent. Why would you use this rather than a GE?
So there's a bunch of different reasons. Sometimes you might not have enough clusters to use a GEE. So in GEE, you have to have around 20 clusters at least, or else the model kind of explodes. Another reason is in GEE modeling, you're treating that cluster as what we call a nuisance parameter. You're not actually interested in its effect. You just need to make sure you account for it and be done with it, set it and forget it. With multi-level modeling, maybe you are interested in that effect and you want to quantify it. And there is a sister paper to this in JAMA. There's a letter, and that talks a little bit about the agency level effects.
Same authors?
Yep.
Ah, interesting. So I don't know. It's Dr. Guterman.
Guterman, yep.
Guterman. I don't know her. What type of doctor is she? Is she a statistician?
Neurologist.
No. She's a neurologist. Wow. And so you obviously know her and worked with her. It sounds like she's really driven by methodology.
She's very driven by methodology and has come up with really creative ways to look at EMS data. And she's passionate about, helping translate some of this science to the field. And she's done a great job at, starting to spread this message. And of course, you look at one agency and you think, oh, well, no, that doesn't happen at my agency. It couldn't, not possible. So you take,
we have no racial differences in analgesia.
There's two kinds of systems, those that have problems and those that don't look.
That's right.
So we'll give Mike Tagman credit on that quote.
I know. What's up with this this two-stage least squares regression?
So that's another way of saying the multi-level modeling. Least squares regression is normal regression. That's just what we do. So when you're talking about least squares, you're getting as close to the line as you can when you're fitting the data, and that's.
I did. So my whole approach to, and I think this worked for a couple of papers, where I said, Remle, I understand that I need to use this test here. And she sent me some code, and I'm like, I know how to do this. I had no clue what regression was. And so thank you, YouTube.
The danger of stats packages.
Yeah, exactly. So thanks to YouTube, I actually read a little bit about regression. I saw my y equals mx plus b, the one thing I remember from
If we
high
call
school.
it machine learning, we can all get paid more.
Yeah, I like it. Sweet. So it actually is something I already
It's
understand.
all based on the same procedures. It's just a matter of how you deal with clustering, if you actually care about its effect or not, and then how you deal with confounding. Because in any study, you have confounding. So one approach is what you're familiar with. We just add it to the model and adjust for it. And then this approach is, well, let's adjust for this other thing and get rid of that random error and see what the direct effect is.
Perfect.
Yep.
So there were two other things in this paper that I did not understand, skipped right over, highlighted, circled, said, ask Remle.
Sounds
What
good.
is an F statistic, and why do we report the numbers in here, and what do those numbers mean?
It's interesting. I think Annals of Emergency Medicine has a problem with p-values.
This might have been an editor comment that said put
No,
it in.
I think that they have jumped on. There's two camps, sort of, those who love p-values and those who are like, erase them all. And I fall
those who are
somewhere in
wrong.
between, right? Like, there's a time and a place. And no, we should never present a naked p-value because that just doesn't mean anything. P less than 0.01.
Much like a naked mole rat.
Man.
No, we're getting scandalous with the
Right.
statistics tonight.
Well, it is kind of hot.
Well, a naked p-value is, men had better outcomes than women, p less than 0.01. But it might have been 32% versus 33%. I need to know that effect size. Don't just tell me p less than 0.01, especially in this big of a data set.
So
I think the F statistic appeared because probably the editors were like, do not show me p-values. I do believe
Okay.
they have that kind of stance on
they
it.
told me that.
That's okay. And so an F statistic is the critical value that if you were to bust open a textbook and look for where do I say P is less than 0.05, you scroll to that F value and then, P is less than.
So then you find a number that
Yeah.
is significant. Say there's less than a 20%
Yep.
chance, whatever. And it would give you a number. And then the further away you get from that number, the more significant it is?
To lower your p-value. Yeah.
Okay. So that's
much
the reason
like,
they
you've
put-
seen the chi-square tables in the back of any stats book. Just open a stats book to the very back. They have these lookup tables. And so you're looking for a critical value, and that's where we're trying to go.
So that's the reason they report it, and several thousand apparently is good.
I didn't look it up, but I trust that it was something important.
So you mentioned you need naked p-values.
Naked
and
p-values
we were
are no
talking
good.
about confounding, so I just have to share this.
Oh, dear.
There is a new study that shows getting hit in the testicles is more painful than childbirth. Now, you might want to know about the methods of the study.
I am curious.
Basically, they surveyed men who had been kicked in the testicles and women who had given birth, and they said after childbirth, 34% of women said yes, they'd like to have another child. And
How soon after childbirth?
well, it doesn't say. And then after getting hit in the testicles, 0% of
Wanted to
men.
do that again.
And that was statistically significant. I imagine the p-value is very, very small.
Well, teenage pregnancy drops drastically after the age of 18.
You're right.
That is amazing. We should just make everybody get older.
Yeah. 25% of traumas occur in the summer. Yeah.
What do you know?
Ice cream sales and trauma is very correlated.
I'm not sure that works in Texas. 50% perhaps.
True.
We have
Maybe.
summer and.
We have summer all year.
There's like 4 seasons.
I think the last thing was falsification test. What is a falsification test?
So another way of thinking about that might be sensitivity test. So to see if the findings still hold after you look at it another way. So in this particular case, they were looking at, there might be some agency level factors that are related to whether or not you give a second dose. So like, is it potentially some protocols that you do a second dose? So they were looking at the data a couple of different ways to see if the findings still hold. And that's a mark of a good analysis, especially with an observational data, is to say, if I analyze this a couple of different ways and make one different decision, do I get totally different results? Because that would give me less certainty around what they actually found. But here, they did it several different ways and keep hitting the same finding.
Yeah, I'm curious, so if you got so fire department gets on scene, they give a dose.
Right.
Transporting unit gets there. And they give 2 more doses en route to the hospital.
Get to the hospital, they ignore everything we did. And
Right. So at the agency level, it would look like they gave 1 dose. So how do you does that?
So that's a really good, important question. In the software, obviously, there is a place to record, that was given prior to arrival.
Sure.
And so when that happens, we can weed it out. But some of these sensitivity analyses are gauging what's just that. It's unmeasured confounding. If it got reported only in the narrative, and in this particular case, didn't read the narratives, then, that's a source of just we would think that would be happening sort of at random within the data set. But, you can certainly think of an effect where, some agencies are more likely to interact with first response that could give midazolam than others. So when it was reported, it was taken into account, but when not, the agency level clustering may help with that, but it's certainly really important to think about, what are limitations in this data set? And that's definitely one.
I like it.
Yep.
Well, see, I have learned a ton here. And I just learned that falsification tests are a fancy way of saying sensitivity analysis.
In this particular case, that's what they were doing. They were just looking at the data a couple of different ways.
I like it. Look at it differently. Yep. Well, how about we get into some results, shall we?
Yeah.
So overall, we know this is a massive data set. This is the 2019 data set.
Before stuff got weird.
Back.
There's just a big asterisk on
as we all go, back in the normal days.
Yeah.
Pre-COVID.
As if we were normal, but.
Well, this is true. Yeah, we thought, oh my God, could it ever get any worse? I want to find the person responsible for saying that out loud.
Whoever said that, no.
It's horrible. It was probably all of us.
Yeah.
So there were 8.3 million records in there, and if you weed out everyone who didn't have a primary or secondary impression of status epilepticus, who was an adult, who didn't get a benzo, you ended up with 7,634 patients, 657 agencies. This is still a really, really big data set, definitely bigger than any of the other randomized control trials, which is the point of this data set. How old were these people? In general, this actually was an average, 46 years old, about half men and half women, 49.4% female.
So the first gut check I would do there is, does that match what we know to be the distribution of patients who have status epilepticus?
Yeah, it
Quick
seems
gut
that
check.
way. For status epilepticus, if you're looking at simple seizures,
Right,
I would expect you to be a little more skewed to the younger population. So
febrile seizures, much younger.
Absolutely. So one of the big points that they were trying to get here is, what is the proportion of seizure treatment that is consistent with guidelines? And remember, guidelines say 10 milligrams of IM midazolam. That would be, survey says 4.1%.
I was about to say, if we were on Facebook Live, we could do a guess.
I know. So 4.1%. Now, I
4.1%.
do want to caution a little bit. Some of this paper reads like a kick EMS in the pants paper. And there definitely are some. Only 4%, these horrible paramedics. There are, I don't think that was the intent, and it's just I'm very sensitive about these things, so, I'm a paramedic. I don't like getting kicked, which is odd, because as a paramedic, you get kicked all the time. I should be used to this.
Back to the original.
And I think it's not an individual, it's a system level thing to say, hey, clearly the protocols don't reflect this 10 mgs IM. And then,
Right.
Me with my improvement science hat on would want to say, well, why not? Can we play Mythbusters with data? Is the thought that if I give 10, that's too much and we're going to have respiratory depression? Well, let's take a look and see what happens.
Yeah.
I haven't done, we actually could do this with
Right?
Oded and look at his app and say, what's the typical dose? I suspect it's, well, I'll tell you what I think it's going to turn out to be because it's
The
going to be
table
here.
says.
But overall, I think the other reason that number is so low is because I think the guidelines, when you do an evidence-based guideline, Mikey, what do the guidelines have to be based on?
Well, you sort of need to be sort of science. It needs to be research. It needs to be evidence.
Evidence, right. Which means if there ain't no damn paper, you can't include that in there. For example, a paper that is comparing intravenous midazolam to intramuscular midazolam. Wasn't there. Guidelines don't address it. So, for example, I like to stay on top of these guidelines. We do 10 milligrams of IM midazolam, unless, of course, you already have an IV. And then I say 5. Is 5 the right number? Beats the hell out of me because, there's no paper on this.
Yeah.
So I would hope that some of the 95.9% of people who were not guideline appropriate were actually giving big doses of IV midazolam.
And so that's a really good point. And so the question we ask is, well, why do the recommendations say IM? Because we can do it faster. Right? Exactly.
Faster.
And so that's actually measured there is how much longer did it take to get an IV?
I was quite surprised at
6
the
minutes.
time.
And when you think about seizure, we know earlier is better. So
Way better.
those minutes could make a difference.
Yeah.
And which is really interesting because I want to come back to this because that I might have been thrown a little bit for a loop by some of the results in here. So when we go back to Rampart, which compared IM midazolam versus IV lorazepam, the IM midazolam won. Well, is that because
It was faster.
IM? Because we know the absorption of IV is faster, but you got to start it, and that takes time. And sure enough, the data here says it takes time too. On average, measuring patient contact to first drug, where did my number go? I want to say it's about 6 minutes. I think that's right. So the IM and IN, both of those were the same, were administered about 6 minutes faster. So we definitely know that. All right, so how much overall? 4.1% got at least 10 milligrams IM midazolam. How about rescue therapy? Overall, again, regardless of how you got it, how much you got, 30% needed a second dose of something. Respiratory support, ventilatory support, 6.1%. So I don't want to get too far into the weeds because I can always throw up the actual table here, which I'll probably do about here.
Yes.
And we can take a look.
Insert
See if
table
that 6
here.
is right.
Right. Yeah, exactly. But I think overall what we found is if you take a look at just how often people did these, 45.6% of patients had the first dose via IV, which we know takes longer. 35% had it via IM, and 19.7%, so 20% got it intranasally. And it was, there is my note, IV route did take 6 minutes longer. IV or IM and IN
Pretty
about
close.
the same. Yeah, not much difference. Now let's get to the thing that just, if you already have an IV, I still think it's probably best just to use that. But we don't have the guidelines to tell us that, what the dose should be. But I'm pretty sure that whatever the dose is should be more than 3 milligrams, which was the median IV dose. Median.
What's the median?
Median. That means some 50% of people treating status, not just any seizure,
Status.
Got less.
got less. How do you even draw up? I mean, I'm assuming it's 2.5.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
so yeah, the median IV dose 3 milligrams. Median IM and IN dose was 5 milligrams.
And it was, everybody got 5 because I think the interquartile range was 5 to
Exactly.
5.
Yeah, it really was, which tells you, and I would suspect that was pretty close to the 3 milligrams because it's easier to draw up. All right, so all of those well below any type of guidelines. So let's take a look then at what is the bottom line? Let's get to this. That's just descriptive statistics. Now when we take a look at the good stuff here, we're going to take a look at the results of all these fancy models that you were just talking about. We're going to talk basically the bottom line, what we're trying to measure here is a risk difference. So 10% of these people needed rescue therapy, 5%, your risk difference is 5%.
So before we even read this, and the reason p-values are gone is, what would you consider to be a clinically relevant risk difference? Would we be okay with it if 5% more patients had to have rescue therapy? Where would you draw that line? So think to yourselves about, well, I think a 5 or 6% difference is a lot, especially if I'm the patient.
Yeah, if you're in that.
Right?
Yeah.
Unless there was a 20% increase in respiratory support.
Right.
That's an important
That's
point.
true.
So there are, as is benefiting an Annals paper, there's not a p-value anywhere in here, but there are 95% confidence intervals. So one thing I'll point out is if you are reading this paper looking at table 3 where'd it go? Particularly table 4, some of the negative signs are missing. But they do give the right numbers in the text, so it is there. So as we're looking at this, basically we're looking for intranasal versus intermuscular, and what we found is that intranasal had 6.5% more rescue therapy. So however you look at the data through all of your analyses, you need to give more benzos if you're giving it through the nose. So,
And does method play a role in that
Right.
too? Like, are we spraying it down the throat, or are we?
Yeah, and it sounds like they're getting smaller doses to begin with anyway. So
right.
if they were
Also,
getting the full dose and it was being properly administered,
right.
maybe it would be a different story. I don't know.
But the one thing I'll say about this analysis that they did, intranasal versus intermuscular, controls for dose.
Right.
So they're adding in that.
Well, and they looked
trying
at
to
dose a couple of different ways, because it's interesting when you do intranasal. What if I give half a dose in one nostril and
Yeah.
half a dose in the other nostril? So they accounted for that. They looked at it both ways and
Yeah.
said, oh, if it was 2 doses within a short amount of
60
time, then
seconds.
we're going to say
It's
it was
one
one
dose.
dose. Yeah.
Yeah. Which, I mean, it makes sense.
That totally makes sense.
And it is beautiful that what that tells me is that, somebody involved in this paper has given intranasal drugs. So that's really a good thing. All right, so controlling for dose, intranasal compared to intramuscular needed more rescue therapy. No difference in the amount of ventilatory support, though. So that's good.
Okay.
So intravenous versus intramuscular. Now, remember, IV took 6 minutes longer, but it turns out IV still needed less, substantially and significantly, clinically and statistically less rescue therapy. How much less? 11% fewer patients needed rescue.
Well, maybe the seizure
with
was going to
IV.
stop anyway because it took so long.
Or maybe they didn't give enough IM, so it didn't have a chance.
All right.
We know they gave 5.
Well, compared to looking at a median of 3, I don't think that was it.
Right.
But again, they controlled for dose. So the bottom line, what we see here is intranasal does not work as well as intermuscular. And contrary to the guidelines, IV actually works better than IM, even accounting for the fact that it took longer, which is something that is different than Rampart. So
Well,
I
and
think
we
that's
should think through some of the drivers here too. What kind of seizure are we talking about? It's hard to get an IV on a seizing patient if we're talking tonic-clonic. So that's another important.
It is. We can do it. I mean,
We can.
every paramedic goes, well, I can.
Yeah.
It doesn't happen in my
I know
system.
You've
can.
also never
You can do it.
And I know you people have never missed an intubation either, right?
Ever.
So one interesting thing when you look at the classic table 1,
I love table ones. Just
Is that your
lays it all
favorite
out.
table?
Yeah, it just lays it all
yeah,
out.
so between 30 and 35% of papal.
Papal?
Yeah, it's
Papal.
they're from Italy.
Every once in a while, East Texas comes out. Around 30%, regardless of how you gave it, had a GCS between 12 and 15.
Yeah, people don't know how to calculate GCS.
That's probably true.
like-
It's Sure they do. It's either 3 or 15.
3, 14, or 15.
Those are the choices.
Yeah.
Well, to the other thing we looked at, this is table 4, looking at that risk difference again based on dose. And they calculated this as a continuous variable and as 2 different ways of dichotomizing it, meaning breaking that continuous into 2 groups. So from a continuous standpoint, what they found is the need for rescue therapy goes down by 2.6% for each additional milligram of, I keep wanting to say of epinephrine, of midazolam. Each additional milligram of midazolam decreases the need for rescue therapy by 2.6%. I would say that's significant, but only if it doesn't increase the need for respiratory support. And this is one of these places where the different sensitivity analysis gave different answers. Overall, when I look at sensitivity analyses, I want them all pointing the same way. If they're not all pointing the same way, I start to wonder maybe if this is random. They were not pointing the same way with this. So overall,
Not pointing the same way or not significant?
I'm sorry, not significant.
So that's where I pay attention to
ways.
the effect size and think about, well, by how much was it not significant, right? Is most of it all on the same side? So if you thought about it, in terms of a forest plot, think about where the dots and the whiskers are. That's how I would read that and say, oh, well, everything's still in the same direction, but our certainty around the estimate gets wider in some cases. And think about those sensitivity analyses get smaller and smaller subgroups. So of course your confidence intervals are getting wider. You're less certain. And so that's how I think they're all going in the same direction.
So,
just not significant.
Well, one is saying on the as treated group, the primary analysis, you had 0.4% increase in the need for ventilatory support with each additional milligram. That confidence interval was, number one, is pretty small, but
Pretty small.
It's 0.14 to 0.67. I mean, we're talking about thousands of patients here, so you're going to be pretty
Real
slight.
tight. Yep.
The sensitivity analysis, on the other hand, came up with 0.13, and that confidence interval was negative 0.33 to positive 0.58. So the instrumental variable, the sensitivity analysis, was not significant, and the as treated was. I think now that's the statistics thing. I'm going to put my doctor hat back on and say, really, 0.4% increase.
Well, and you're doing
rather
per
stop
mig,
the
which is in this data set that's important, is that there's not a data point at each milligram, right? So we have to think about what data were there. And that's like, oh, well, if 5 is good, well, 6, 7, 8, 9, 12 must be better. Well, no, the data stopped somewhere, right? So we can't,
Right.
Extrapolation is one of those deadly sins of statistics. So we have to be careful about, well, where were the data points clustered and how much certainty do we have around that? So the linear one, I read it and I'm like, okay, but I also think in terms of what do the protocols probably say? And it tells you what are the most common doses.
Yeah. So let's get to the dichotomous group. The first dichotomous group split the doses. And by the way, this is all controlled for route. Is that better?
In addition to some other things, there's age, sex, those things are in there as well.
Was it age, sex, and race and drug use, I think, were the key ones they control. So this one, they're breaking it up between greater than 5 milligrams or 5 or greater and less than 5. All right. And there, what they found, same concept, 11% decreased risk of rescue therapy with greater than 5 milligram dosing. Need for respiratory support was not significant in either one of the analyses. And this is one of the reasons I have a tendency to discount the continuous variable there. So less rescue therapy, no change in respiratory support. How about let's go really big and look at 10 or greater.
Let's go.
And less than
How
10.
many people got greater?
And this is, well, exactly. Considering how it comes, I'm pretty sure they got 10. That was 10.7% more rescue therapy with less than 10. Here there actually was, and this one gets my attention, 2.7% increase in ventilatory support. That was statistically significant. Then when you look at the sensitivity analysis, it was not significant. So a little fuzzy on ventilatory support. I think the key thing here is the need for rescue therapy. So those are the bottom lines. I do think the limitations, man, they really did a good job. You can tell, or at least I can, looking at this, that they've been down this road before, and it looks like they've been down this road with their prior paper. And there were a lot of things they wanted to they got their do-over. And they're like, I really want to control for this. I want to control for this. And they really thought this out well. So I was pleased with this. So let's just get to the bottom line, shall we?
I would love to get to the bottom line.
Did y'all hear that? That was sarcasm. That was snark. And it was coming from Mikey and not Remle.
That's unusual.
That was the impressive thing. Because for me, Mikey just, he likes doing podcasts. Remle, on the other hand, I had to pay her and I had to bribe her, and y'all know what she requires, right?
Yeah,
Tacos.
get a close up of those.
So our spouses and Kenny are waiting for us to get our butts done.
Let's go.
So we can have some
Waiting
tacos.
patiently.
All right, here are my take-home points, shall we? Number one, I think the biggest takeaway confirms everything else we've seen. No matter how you give it, we're underdosing midazolam, not giving enough. Next, I think the take-home here is intranasal just does not work as well as intramuscular or intravenous.
Yeah.
And speaking of intravenous, unlike Rampart, we saw that even though IV takes longer, it actually stops seizures better. And that was the surprising point for me. And then you got to follow it up with one more time, we just don't follow guidelines very well. So we collectively need to do a better job of that. What am I going to do differently? Well, I think still my protocols say 10 milligrams IM ASAP unless you already have an IV. And then I say 5. What's the right dose? Beats the hell out of me.
Yeah. Do you have,
because
do
there's
you have
no
a
paper.
limit on your dosing, or do you just give it till the cows come, till the seizure stops?
No, we do have a limit.
How come?
Because there's only so much Versed you have on the truck.
Well, and then there's another study.
The limit literally is
of course.
you run out of Versed.
Okay.
Well, and so the next
Yeah.
study we look at is using ketamine as the rescue therapy, right? So
Absolutely.
there's some research around ketamine for
Thank you,
refractory
Ken
seizures.
Shepke.
Yep.
Yeah.
I might add that's in the protocols too. So I don't know what the right IV dose is. And that is some, I think I would kind of like some additional work there. Yeah, so really that's the future questions we need. What's the right IV dose?
Well, I also think, what's the worst? Well, I mean, I guess what are the priorities in the management of these patients, right? I think it's to stop the seizure. We need to stop the seizure. So if there is a 2.4% increase of ventilatory support needed, okay,
We should probably make sure that the people giving the drug are capable of doing the ventilatory support.
which I think most probably could be. I think recognizing the need for that ventilatory
Yes.
support, that's a different story.
No doubt.
But I think anyone can manage a simple airway with an OPA or an MPA and a BVM.
Or BiPAP. I mean, BiPAP was
Yeah,
included.
Yeah,
in it.
yeah,
was a
exactly.
choice.
So I mean, I
Or
think
CPAP.
what's like I feel like ventilatory support is like this scary thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think people need to know that
More scary is a seizure that doesn't stop.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely.
We can take care of these people for a while. Let's manage their airway. It's okay. Like I think if people just realize that this is a possibility from this intervention that you need to be aware of, good. But we need to remember why we're giving it, and that's to stop the seizure.
Right.
Not because
Yeah.
we're worried about having to bag them or whatever. It's okay if you have to bag somebody.
I will point out, please, if you do have to RSI these people because you're just giving them so many benzos, or ketamine, or whatever else you're giving them, and they stop breathing, please, for the love of all that's holy, make sure that the ER doctor knows that you paralyzed them. Just because you paralyze them, they don't look like they're seizing anymore. That doesn't mean they're not seizing.
Exactly.
Remember, the seizure is happening up here.
Yep.
The only way to tell if someone is seizing after you paralyze them is with an EEG. So make sure you do that. What other takeaways do you have, Mikey?
I mean, that was pretty much it. I mean, I think, like I said, the primary thing we got to worry about, let's stop the seizure. If we have to bag them, we do. And follow your protocols, for crying out loud, right? Like if it's 10, give them 10. Like don't try to, I mean, it gets a little weird. Like I'm not sure why there's a hesitancy to, and you sort of hit on a little bit. Like, is it the 78-year-old little lady that's 110 pounds and I'll give them what I think they should give. Maybe it's 3.6.
My guess here, though, and this is, again,
I mean,
let's check ODED's stuff. My guess is that they're giving what their protocols tell them to give. I think this is a problem that me and my fellow medical directors need to solve. I don't think this is paramedics saying, well, I just don't want to give all that. That's my guess.
I know there is something to that, though.
I think you're probably right.
I mean, I think that's
certainly with analgesia.
Yeah.
I think that's
for
right.
sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, that was pretty much mine.
Androparidol, the world's greatest drug.
I knew that was going to come into this.
Always a way to slide.
Always does.
Remle, what are your takeaways? What do you think?
You hit them on the head. I think this, to me, was an episode of Data Mythbusters. So if we're saying, think about the drivers, why are the protocols still at 5? And I think people do have the fear of, they're going to need ventilatory support. But this was very much an episode of Data Mythbusters in my eyes around that It's safe to give 10 IM, and that's what we should be doing, and that there's still potential for residual confounding in these data. And remember, there were not a lot of people that got the right dose and the right route, so that makes it hard to do those estimates. So if we change our protocols and start seeing more 10 mgs at IM, we may see better outcomes, and that's my key takeaway.
Let's hope.
Yep.
illuminating the darkness of clinical practice with the bright light of science. See, I feel like we were very illuminating.
It's pretty good.
Guys, thank you all very much. And thank you very much for indulging me. I had some statistical questions, some methodology questions I really wanted to know the answer to. Thank you very much, Dr. Crowe, for
You have a
answering
fast
those
forward
for me.
button.
I do. Yes, this is true. Just pop that on YouTube. Mikey, welcome to Texas, man.
Thank you. Appreciate
Glad
it.
to have you here.
Happy to be here. Yeah.
Guys, y'all take care.
See you later.
You've been listening to the EMS Lighthouse Project podcast, a proud member of the FlightBridge Ed podcast family and a Firedog production. Visit flightbridgeed.com for more information.